Welcome back to the show. Joining us now to continue the conversation is General John Teichert. He served as Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of the Air Force. Thank you so much for joining us.
Wyatt, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Perhaps let's just start out because before the break, we heard from a member of Congress who was suggesting that, going into some of these discussions with President Putin of Russia, of course, there was a lot of concern that maybe the administration would do things to try and appease the Russians. Of course, that didn't really happen. Anyways, looking at Donald Trump's Truth Social in recent hours, even, he posted a meme basically equating himself to what Richard Nixon did to stand up to Russia back over the course of his presidency. I guess just to kind of begin here, do you think that Donald Trump is kind of being that authoritative figure in standing up to, Russia and President Putin specifically?
Wyatt, I don't think there was any chance of getting Putin to the negotiating table without the threats and demonstrations of strength that he saw and we saw in President Trump back in July. In fact, I think it was those deadlines when it was clear that Putin had exceeded the patience threshold of the President of the United States that started to create concern in the mind of the Russian leader that he was going to face sanctions and secondary sanctions if he didn't demonstrate in a tangible way a willingness to start the peace process. And so it was only because of strength and threats and costs that the Russian leader understood that he needed to start this process. And that's what brought him to Alaska last week. And that's what continues to force him to demonstrate a willingness to negotiate in good faith going forward.
I guess I'm also wondering too, though, because there's a lot of conversation, not even just with respect to Ukraine, but if you look to the conflict in Israel and the Middle East as well. I think people in the United States and Canada and Western countries are kind of growing more and more frustrated with the level of domestic involvement and involvement from, again, Western countries in some of the wars and stuff happening overseas. But at the same time, Donald Trump seemingly looking like he might be able to put an end and come up with some type of a peace agreement with respect to this conflict is something that kind of, I'm sure, will end up resonating with people. So I guess how do you kind of balance that? But then also Donald Trump has ruled out, putting U.S. troops on the ground. How effective can Trump's security guarantees that he has proposed for Ukraine end up being if he's not willing to put troops on the ground?
Wyatt, I think it is important that there are some type of ironclad security guarantees because we've got to assume that Putin's going to lie and Putin's going to cheat. In fact, the only reason that we are in this situation is because Putin back in 2014 violated the Budapest Memorandum from 1994 that said if that Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons, that he would never threaten or attack Ukraine. And then we saw that they have. Now, how those security guarantees actually play out, there's a lot of maneuver room there. But I think talk of Article 5 like guarantees is a very powerful way to demonstrate our commitment, the Europeans' commitment, to make sure that this isn't just a fleeting peace, but a lasting peace. And I also think that even these talks thus far in the last week have demonstrated that Putin is starting to back off of any intent to negotiate in good faith, which is a great sign that maybe we need to start enacting or raising the costs in his mind in order to actually to get him to the table and be willing to negotiate in a way that understands that there will be trade-offs involved.
And do you think, obviously, when Volodymyr Zelensky came to the White House the first time, it was very public, kind of back and forth, and Donald Trump and him and J.D. Vance got into an argument there in the Oval Office as well. Do you think countries overseas, whether it be Ukraine and even Israel, again, as another example, do you think there's any, world in which they are kind of taking the support of the United States for granted here? And how should Donald Trump kind of prevent that from happening?
Wyatt, I think that we have seen just in the last several months that the President of the United States has said, we are willing to engage in the world when it is in our interest, but we must not do so in an unsustainable way. And I think that our targeted engagement in Ukraine, our targeted engagement in support of our friends in Israel, and then the negotiations that have caused our European NATO allies to be willing to raise their defense spending to 5% of GDP are indications that the United States can be trusted, but must not be trampled upon. And I think that they have seen, or we have seen for far too long, a disproportionate amount of U.S. involvement in spending to support the well-being of others instead of, again, putting America first.
Okay, we are going to take a quick break. When we return, General John Teichert is going to be back with us. Stay with us. We'll be right back.